Right, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today, whether you're here in person or in Westminster, or those people who are online today. Either way, you're equally welcome. I made reference to time. I hope you'll excuse us, but we've got quite a lot to say. So we are going to be talking at you for about 45 minutes, trying to cover actually 45 recommendations which are in the report, but then we'll have another 45 minutes for Q&A, so hopefully that will work. For those who don't know, I'm John Armitt, Chair of the Commission, and joining me today are Professor Jim Hall, James Heath, our Chief Executive, Nick Windsor, Sadie Morgan and Tim Besley, all of whom are Commissioners. Our Deputy Chair, Julia Prescott, and other Commissioners are up in Leeds, holding a similar event there at the moment. Together, we're today marking the publication of the second National Infrastructure Assessment. Formulating an assessment every 5 years is the Commission's main responsibility. It's our independent review of what the UK's economic infrastructure needs are likely to be over the next 20 to 30 years. How much it will cost to meet those needs, and where the investment will come from, and what policy and regulatory changes will be necessary. The first assessment was published in 2018. It heavily informed government's current national infrastructure strategy. The last thing we want to do is rip everything up and start again. And as I will come on to shortly, policy certainty and funding stability are the cornerstones, of course, of effective infrastructure policy. But we do need to recognise that some things have changed in the last 5 years. The very fact that we have more people joining us online than in the room is a symptom of a major shift to hybrid working, which is relevant as to how we think about transport infrastructure. We've also seen the impact of the invasion of Ukraine on energy prices and the related cost of living pressures. And it bears repeating that the Commission is here to look past the immediate political and economic noise and keep our eyes fixed firmly on a longer horizon and what we need to do to get there. Our job is to follow the evidence and to answer the hardest infrastructure questions. As advisors to government, we do operate within some ground rules. Our work takes as given the UK's legal commitments to meet net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And we have objectives to support economic growth across all regions and to generally improve the quality of life. These objectives set the framework for the second assessment, which focuses on three big strategic objectives. How can economic infrastructure be modernised to promote productivity and economic growth across all regions, principally through transport and digital networks? Support transition to net zero, where the energy sector will play a particularly large role, but all sectors have a part to play. And improve climate resilience and the state of the natural environment, which again is a huge shared endeavour across all sectors. You'll see that structure reflected through the report. Our work has a second ground rule. We are given a budgetary envelope known as the fiscal remit, within which all our recommendations for public expenditure must be costed. This is currently set at 1.1 to 1.3% of GDP, so approximately 30 billion per year. You'll not be surprised that we've generally followed the 1.3 figure rather than the 1.1. We also have a duty to spell out the levels of private investment that we anticipate will be needed to modernise our infrastructure and the impact that this is likely to have on household bills. And it's absolutely right that we should be upfront about these costs. Households deserve transparency about where their taxes are going and how and why their utility bills may be changing. And they deserve clarity on the benefits of improving our infrastructure and on the cost of inaction, because the scale of the challenge is large. While infrastructure performs well in some areas, in others there are significant deficiencies that are holding the UK back. There's been underinvestment in transport systems in cities outside of London. No major water reservoirs have been built in England in the last 30 years. Too many properties are at risk of flooding. Recycling rates have not increased in a decade, and our wastewater services do not meet public expectations on the environment. This situation must improve. So let me give you the good news. Things can certainly get better. we can achieve low carbon and resilient infrastructure that supports economic growth and better protects the natural environment. It can do all that within the fiscal remit set by government, with levels of public investment staying at similar amounts to those committed to in the current spending period. And while private investment will need to significantly increase to deliver infrastructure, particularly in the energy and water sectors, the Commission calculates that household bills for infrastructure services can come down over time. But getting there will require some bold decisions and sticking to a long-term plan, one that supports households through the transition in a way that is affordable and fair. Pace must be valued over perfection in some areas. Options needed to be closed down where the risk of delay is greater than the risk of making a suboptimal decision. Government, regulators and industry must act urgently, with policies of sufficient scale to attract the private investment required and enable rapid delivery on the ground. This is a big task, but it is achievable. We must remember that the UK has made major changes to infrastructure before, from building the electricity supergrid in the 1950s to constructing the strategic road network in the 60s and 70s, and we can do so again. The fact you're joining us today suggests that you've got a stake in that transformation. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll introduce our main findings and recommendations, and then we'll have plenty of time, as I said earlier, for discussion. I'll turn first to Nick Windsor, who will cover the headlines on net zero and, in particular, the future challenges of energy. Thank you. Nick.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. Energy lies at the heart of the task of reducing carbon emissions. By international standards, of course, the UK has made good progress on this, mainly by removing coal from power generation. But there are greater challenges ahead. Phasing out the use of fossil fuels to generate electricity, heat our homes and power our vehicles is essential for the UK to meet its legally binding climate targets. This shift will also bring economic benefits, and any future shocks to oil and gas prices should, under our plans, have a much smaller impact on the cost of living in the future. Furthermore, if the UK can move fast, many of our domestic businesses should be able to become leaders in low-carbon technologies. The way we are proposing to achieve this is to replace these fossil fuels with low-cost, reliable, low-carbon electricity. In the longer term, electrifying the energy system will lower energy costs for households and businesses. So government needs to accelerate the deployment of offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar power. And these need to be complemented by flexible technologies that can generate if the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. Just thinking about those technologies, they can be divided into two categories: short-term flexibility, which would balance the grid within a day, things like interconnectors, batteries, demand-side response, and long-term flexibility, where the renewable supply needs to be topped up over days or weeks. The latter, in our view, should be provided by electricity generated by hydrogen or by gas with carbon capture and storage. We've come up with figures for both sectors there. Our modelling suggests that 60 gigawatts of short-term flexible capacity will be needed by 2035. We currently have about 15 gigawatts in that category, so we're talking about a big shift, but a manageable one. And we think by 2035, we will need about 12 gigawatts of hydrogen or gas with carbon capture and storage to generate electricity for longer-term flexibility. That's about 30 terawatt hours, about 6% of electricity production. A business model to support the gas generation with carbon capture and storage has already been developed, so that's good news. And the same will need to happen for hydrogen-fired generation, and we believe this needs to happen quickly. Delivering a highly renewable system will go a long way to protecting the economy from energy price shocks in the future. But to further reduce the impact of any shocks that do come, we are recommending the government should establish a strategic energy reserve. In the long term, the store of energy would be in the form of hydrogen, although hydrogen-fired generation will only gradually build up. So in the short term, some of that store may actually comprise storing natural gas for CCS-equipped gas plants. The store should be built up over time, but by 2040, we'd recommend the total capacity should be sufficient to provide about 2 months of the non-renewable part of the electricity supply system at that time. That's about 25 terawatt hours. As normal with strategic reserves, the use of it would be controlled by ministers. Building in this resilience is estimated to add about 2% to the average energy bill. But improving the ability of the system to absorb shocks will be an investment well made. We might well note at this point that the Energy Price Guarantee Scheme will end up having cost taxpayer about £30 billion. So that dwarfs what we're proposing in terms of strategic reserve. Speaking of investment well made, let's turn to our proposals to electrify domestic heating by a substantial programme of investing in heat pumps. Heating buildings still accounts for 24% of fossil fuel demand, and currently almost 9 out of 10 English homes are reliant on natural gas for heating. So the challenge is large. But this work is essential, not just to cut emissions, but also to improve air quality and to permanently reduce heating costs. Because once policy costs are shifted off electricity bills and we move away from fossil fuel pricing of electricity, the evidence suggests that the running costs for heat pumps will be lower than that for gas boilers. It's fair to say at present, a lack of clear information, patchy access to installers, and high upfront costs all discourage the shift that we need to see. So households need to be strongly supported to make the transition to heat pumps. We think that heat pumps should be the dominant solution for domestic heating. They are highly efficient. They are available now, and they are the solution being deployed at scale in other countries, as you can see from this chart. And there's growing evidence that heat pumps are suitable in a wide range of building types. The government has stated that 90% of homes already have sufficient energy efficiency to accommodate a heat pump. This aligns with evidence that buildings with an EPC rating of D or above, which make up 90% of homes, are likely to have a peak heat loss rate that makes them suitable for heat pumps with minimal or no energy efficiency improvements. That said, where households do want to improve energy efficiency of their homes, they should certainly be encouraged to do so, given the knock-on benefits in reducing the amount of energy that we need. So government should encourage the installation of energy efficiency measures through our proposals, through zero-interest loans, helping to pave the way for heat pump deployment. Our assessment also sets out a programme for energy efficiency upgrades in social housing and for households on lower incomes, with the social housing element delivered through a multi-year devolved settlement to local authorities. We're not arguing that heat pumps are suitable for every single property. In a small proportion of homes, another electric heating option or potentially heat networks may be more suitable. But what we are saying unambiguously is that we do not see any role for hydrogen in the future of home heating. We set out our reasons in some detail in the report, but put simply, hydrogen for this purpose will not be available to make any material contribution to the 6th carbon budget target. It simply is not anywhere near ready at scale, and it's very difficult to believe it could be. Secondly, using electricity to produce hydrogen, to then use that hydrogen in boilers to produce heat, requires 5 to 6 times more clean electricity than using the same electricity directly in a heat pump. Our clean electricity is going to be like gold dust. We cannot afford to throw away 4/5 of it in that way. We must use it efficiently. And thirdly, the process of area-by-area switching would be incredibly complex to conduct safely, involving access to every single property in an area served by an existing grid on the same day, with considerable loss of service during conversion. A decision by government not to support heating by hydrogen still leaves open the potential for commercial development of networks to provide this service to customers who want it. However, this will only happen, in our view, if it proves commercially viable, and on the figures, we doubt it. But if we're going to focus solely on electrification, we must address the other barriers to heat pump take-up. We recommend three things: that government should commit £2.5 billion a year to cover the full cost of heat pump installations and support energy efficiency improvements for households on lower incomes. Together with the full subsidy for social housing, this means that the costs for around a third of English homes will be covered in full. For everyone else, we propose to provide a subsidy of £7,000 per property owner for installing a heat pump or connecting to a heat network from 2024, tapering down over time to encourage early take-up. And thirdly, we propose that government should provide a 0% financing facility for the upfront costs above the subsidy. This comprehensive and fully costed package would need to be complemented by a range of other steps to address planning and other barriers. But the benefit of our package is that it enables us to stop pumping natural gas into homes by 2050. This is an absolute necessity if we're going to meet the UK's net zero commitment. And without a plan that fully covers lower income households, they would be left with higher long-term heating bills. I'll stop there on heating. Before I hand back to John, let me complete the energy picture with a word about the new networks that we are suggesting in the assessment. And those networks do involve a substantial role for hydrogen, and they're all about helping to decarbonise heavy industry. Industry needs clarity from government on what decarbonisation routes will be open to them, and certainty on where the supporting infrastructure will be available and by when. Core networks to transmit and store both hydrogen and carbon are essential by 2035. Even if we set aside our domestic emissions targets for a moment, which of course we shouldn't, the global customers will be demanding low carbon products by then. So I think we are the first body to set out, at least publicly, an indicative map. I'm very proud of it. You can see here the map showing the two skeleton core networks that we're proposing. In essence, our proposed carbon transmission network initially covers Grangemouth and North East Scotland, Teesside, Humberside, Merseyside, the Peak District and Southampton, obviously picking up the industrial clusters very heavily. Similarly, the core hydrogen transmission network should connect Grangemouth, North East Scotland, Teesside, Humberside, Merseyside and South Wales. The assessment explores the business models and other levers at the government's disposal to help ensure these networks are delivered on time. Thank you. Back to you, John.
Thanks, Nick. Staying briefly on decarbonisation, I'll say a word about electric vehicles. Increasing the adoption of electric vehicles will be a key to decarbonising surface transport. Electric cars and vans are the future of road transport. As well as being zero emission, they are cheaper to run and create less air pollution. We explored this in some depth in the first assessment, and in this one, we restate that consumers will only purchase electric vehicles if they are confident they can charge them when they need to. There's been progress in the last 5 years, but the growth trajectory on charge points remains steep. Government should ensure that there is a nationwide network of public charge points reaching at least 300,000 chargers across the UK by 2030. These charge points must be spread across all regions of the country to support every consumer to make that switch. Stopping the sale of new petrol and diesel cars will only ever be a backstop for a decision that motorists need to take for positive reasons. So while, of course, we note the government's recent change to the deadline, our recommendations for the infrastructure remain the same. We're now going to move on to looking at how infrastructure can support economic growth across regions and improve living standards. We consider that transport and digital services are a key component in this. On transport, we need to help cities reach their productivity potential by enhancing their transport systems. And we need to improve our national road and rail network to better connect the cities together and support trade in goods and services. There's not a choice between intra-city and intercity transport. We must improve both at the same time. But let me first address the elephant in the room. Government's decision on the future of High Speed 2 project clearly happened very late in the day when it came to the planning assumptions we used in formulating our assessment. And as we said at the time, the Commission thinks the recent decision is deeply disappointing. It leaves a major gap in UK rail strategy around which a number of cities have based their economic growth plans. Where until recently we did have a long-term strategy for rail in the Integrated Rail Plan, we now have a collection of rail projects at various stages of maturity. What government should do now and urgently is work with local leaders to turn a collection of schemes into a rigorously costed portfolio of rail improvements with clear delivery timescales designed to address the long-standing capacity and connectivity challenges facing the North and the Midlands. The Commission stands ready to help the government with this important task. Alongside this, government should take a hard look at the governance and the delivery arrangements for future major rail projects. We must learn the lessons of HS2 and ensure that project design, management, supply chain contracting and oversight are all set up to exert a much tighter grip on cost and delivery. Now, a key message in the assessment is that government's first priority should be to better maintain our existing national road and rail networks. The UK economy is largely structured around these networks. They support trade in goods and services. And in future, Network Rail and national highways will likely need more money to keep up with renewing ageing assets and deal with climate change impacts. But when it comes to roads, we've also undertaken some new analysis to understand what a strategic package of road enhancement should focus on. We've identified some of the worst performing routes on the network with substantial passenger and freight demand between key cities and towns. You can see the map here. There's no shortage of such positions. But I should stress that this is not a literal roadmap of ready-to-go projects, but further work needs to be undertaken with the regional transport bodies and others to discern the right schemes to take forward. Any road advancement must, of course, be compatible with targets to reduce carbon emissions. This is why, as I said earlier, we need to decarbonise vehicles so that productive journeys are clean journeys. Drawing these threads together on road and rail, we recommend that government produces an integrated strategy for both road and rail and interurban transport. This should include a pipeline of strategic improvements over the next 30 years that is aligned with the wider complementary plans and policies to support regional and local economic growth. Sadie will now cover our urban transport recommendations.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. Our cities should be major, main drivers of economic growth. They have the highest employment density and largest concentrations of productive businesses. But large English cities outside London are less productive than comparable European cities, partly because they have worse public transport networks. Better transport networks also improve quality of life by making it easier to access public services, retail and leisure activities. Travel demand patterns have changed following the COVID-19 pandemic, but this has not weakened the case for long-term investment. England's largest cities have congested roads and inadequate public transport networks, which constrain their economic growth. This chart shows how some of England's biggest cities fare compared to European cities of similar size when it comes to rapid access to their centres. Of course, radial routes aren't everything, but as a ready reckoner, it shows the challenge we have to keep our cities moving with productive journeys. The solution, of course, is better public transport and more safer, active travel. Today, we make the case for government to invest £22 billion to improve public transport in the largest cities outside London to unlock economic growth. Birmingham, Bristol, Leeds and Manchester are important economic hubs within their wider regions, but, from our analysis, face the biggest transport capacity constraints. They should be the initial priorities for investment in mass transit systems. This chart shows the kind of shortfall in public transport capacity over the longer term given these cities' anticipated employment growth, even if working from home remains established. The different colours show different scenarios, explained in full in our report. But the light blue and mauve colours, never know why people choose mauve, but anyway. The second and third bar for each city represents what we consider to be reasonable central scenario. Just to spell this out, as it stands, Birmingham could have 20,000 more people wanting to travel into the city centre during the midweek peak by 2050 than it does today. We have to get moving on mass transit solutions to address this. As cities will be the primary beneficiaries of better public transport, they should, of course, contribute to the costs. Cities should have the autonomy to fund as well as find local infrastructure solutions. Unfortunately, investment in public transport alone will not suffice to reduce congestion and improve capacity. Once it is in place as a viable alternative to private car travel, cities will, of course, need to reduce those car journeys into city centres, especially at peak times. Measures such as congestion charging and workplace parking levers that operate in some places today can help reduce car use, thereby freeing up room on the roads for more public transport. We know this is a politically charged subject, but the Commission's job is to give candid advice. You don't unlock economic growth by clogging up cities. In our view, it's reasonable to place some practical limits on access to road space by private cars, where the alternative is significantly worse congestion, as long as the system is fair and as long as public transport alternatives are there. More broadly, we need to accelerate and expand the devolution of transport budgets beyond our biggest city regions. This will give local authorities the freedom to identify local priorities, such as fixing potholes and road improvements, and resources to address them. We say that the city regional sustainable transport settlement model that's a difficult one to say. We say that the city regional sustainable transport settlements, model should be extended beyond the mayoral combined authorities to all local strategic transport authorities, and the trailblazer deals granted to Greater Manchester and West Midlands rolled out to all mayoral combined authorities as soon as possible. London also requires a long-term funding settlement to enhance its world-class public transport network. Short-term funding deals for Transport for London should be replaced with longer-term capital settlements to support housing and economic growth. Before I hand back to John, I will say a word about two more things: digital and design. The second assessment sets out how improving digital connectivity can lower costs for firms, enable technological changes and innovation, and provide businesses with access to a wider pool of talent. Since the Commission called for a national plan for broadband in our first assessment, there has been significant progress in the rollout of gigabit-capable broadband, from 6% back in 2018 to 74% of households today. And this hasn't been by accident, but by policy design. As this chart shows, government is on track to deliver its gigabit-capable coverage targets. But we can't be complacent, and policy and regulation must continue to support network competition and private investment. Government should also finish delivering the £5 billion subsidy programme to provide coverage to the hardest to reach areas. And when it comes to 5G, government should support a market-led approach by improving the consistency of planning approvals across the country and supporting access to spectrum for localised private networks. So far, we've covered energy, transport and digital. The assessment covers much more. Across the three strategic aims of net zero, levelling up and climate resilience that John set out at the start. But what unites them all? Anyone who knows me won't be surprised that I start with the importance of design. Good infrastructure design is more than aesthetics. Good infrastructure design provides value for people, places, and the climate. Good infrastructure design helps projects finish on time and at lower cost, not least because it can improve engagement with local communities. Following the first assessment, the NIC's design group produced a set of high-level design principles to provide a framework for embedding good design at every stage of a project's development. We're pleased to see that these have been picked up by a number of major operators. But more needs to be done, particularly to ensure that board-level design champions are in place for all major projects and that they are properly resourced to undertake the role. The Institute of Civil Engineers is working to further define and develop the scope of design champions, and it's really fantastic that they've published their latest supportive findings today. For our part, the design group will be developing guidance on embedding project-specific design principles. We hope in time the IPA will be able to take these forward, ensuring all nationally significant projects implement the guidance effectively. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sadie. And on the note of cross-cutting themes, let me mention some other conditions that we think will need to be in place to help attract the levels of private investment that will be necessary to deliver the infrastructure we need. Firstly, an effective planning system that enables good decisions to be made swiftly is essential. Delays in getting consent for energy grid projects is without doubt one of the biggest constraints on reaching net zero. While the nationally significant infrastructure planning framework, NSIPS, initially worked well, it has deteriorated in recent years. Consenting timelines have slowed by 65% over the last decade to over a 4-year period on average. Government has taken some positive steps towards reform, but more is needed, including updates to national policy statements at least every 5 years, better use of environmental data, a meaningful and consistent approach to community benefits, and integrated spatial planning. The UK's system of economic regulation needs to be updated to enable the transformational change required in infrastructure. The first step is to ensure that the regime retains the confidence of the public and private sector. To do this, regulators must ensure that the private companies they regulate are financially sustainable. Government must empower the regulator to facilitate investment through regular strategic policy statements, and regulators need to enhance the use of competition for major strategic investments. Finally, new business models will be needed to support the deployment of new networks and technologies, as Nick has already touched on. All this is explored in more detail in Chapter 6 of the assessment. But I'd now like to invite Jim to introduce our work on climate resilience and the environment.
Thank you, John. Infrastructure and the natural environment are interdependent. The services that we rely on from infrastructure are threatened by environmental risks, but on the other hand, infrastructure systems themselves impact the environment. Regrettably, infrastructure has in the past been responsible for harmful impacts on the environment, air, water, biodiversity. But in the future, infrastructure can instead contribute to a healthier environment, whilst also being resilient to a changing climate. Starting with resilience, it's important to remember that most of the infrastructure assets that are going to be operating in the 2050s already exist. So better asset management of existing assets to enhance their resilience is critical. To support this, government needs to establish clear outcome-based standards for infrastructure asset performance, upon which regulators and operators can base their asset management and renewal plans. In some sectors, these standards already exist. In the energy sector, for example, distribution companies have a 12-hour target to restore electricity supply if it fails in normal weather conditions. However, there's a really significant variation in expectations for performance standards across infrastructure services. Delay in producing a comprehensive set of outcome-based standards risks missing some key junctures where better resilience can be baked into operators' business plans. As you can see from this chart, over the next 6 years, there are a number of price review periods coming up. We've calculated that around 400 billion of spending on infrastructure will be committed during these rounds. The risk is that without clarity on standards, this investment will not fully optimize resilience. But to assess where current service levels are feasible or affordable in a changing climate, government and the public need to understand how much achieving these standards might cost and what the implications of different standards might be. For example, rail can be made more resilient to rail buckling in very hot weather, but the process of doing that is costly, so the right balance needs to be struck between acceptable cost versus speed restrictions on hot days. So our recommendation is that infrastructure operators should be required to set out the costs of maintaining outcome-based resilience standards in the face of a changing climate, supported by data from the Met Office. The assessment covers some specific areas of resilience, namely flooding and droughts, in some detail, drawing on past Commission studies. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into those in great depth. Those of you in the audience who are interested in those areas will already be aware of our past recommendations. But in a very brief summary, the assessment reiterates that government should invest in enhanced flood risk management infrastructure to reduce the risks of coastal, river and surface water flooding, with clear risk reduction targets, and in the case of surface water, improved data gathering and coordinated governance between the Environment Agency, local authorities and water companies at a local level. We also say that the government should follow a twin-track approach to drought resilience by managing demand and increasing supply. Both reducing demand, including leakage, and providing new water infrastructure will require additional investment in the upcoming Sector Price Review 2024 and beyond. Now, turning to environmental improvements. Government already requires biodiversity net gain for new infrastructure projects. That is the right thing to do if we are to reverse biodiversity loss in this country. We also believe that the government should require sectors with the biggest opportunity, transport, water and flood risk management, to take a strategic approach to enhancing natural capital across their assets. The assessment therefore proposes that operators in these sectors are given a duty to publish regular reports on the state of water quality and biodiversity on their estates and areas affected by their operations. That data should underpin maintenance and renewal strategies that deliver net improvement, with a focus on nature-based solutions and a presumption in favor of improving existing assets rather than building new ones. Given the particular concern about water quality right now, let me say a word about that. The level of pollution from wastewater treatment works and sewer overflows damages the environment and is unacceptable to the public. Public distrust has been exacerbated by inadequate monitoring of the scale and length of spills. Government has set out a plan for tackling combined sewer overflows, and that will require major infrastructure changes. Progress has got to be made quickly, but through solutions that offer best value. It would surely be a missed opportunity if we were to tackle discharges from storm overflows by pouring more concrete underground and investing in end-of-pipe solutions, rather than seeking to treat rainwater differently and invest in catchment-based approaches. Overall, we're confident that as long as individual schemes are well designed, water quality, air quality, and biodiversity should be improved as a result of this National Infrastructure Assessment's recommendations. You can see a summary of that in the report, and more details will be published on our website shortly. I'll finish up with our recommendation on how to curb emissions generated by the waste sector and encourage a move to a more circular economy. The solid waste sector contributes about 5% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions, and the sector's emissions are not declining. Recycling rates have stalled at around 45%. The government has set targets to reduce waste, but it's the Commission's view that current policies are insufficient to address these issues. We need to see implementation of the government's simpler recycling proposals, a deposit return scheme for drinks containers, an expansion of the producer responsibility for packaging. The sooner these reforms are implemented, the sooner more waste can be recycled rather than treated lower down the waste hierarchy. But the government's own analysis highlights that these measures will not achieve 65% of recycling target by 2035. So further action is going to be needed. We think this means expanding the recent single-use plastics ban to cover a wider range of hard-to-recycle plastics. And the biggest impact will be in helping local authorities drive up recycling rates. We propose that they each develop tailored targets with government support for low-cost capital enhancements where necessary. As you can see from the chart, a significant growth in recycling infrastructure capacity will be needed over the next 30 years, with the brown colour in the middle representing material recycling facilities capacity. The dark blue wedge represents energy from waste, and that needs to reduce considerably. Energy from waste is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, second only to landfill. All new energy from waste plants need to be carbon capture ready to hit net zero. And the Commission's analysis suggests there's already sufficient operating capacity in place or in the pipeline to avoid the need for new energy from waste facilities which are not carbon capture ready. We therefore recommend that local authorities should not sign or renew any more long-term contracts for energy from waste services that don't have credible plans for carbon capture and storage. Alongside this, to encourage more investment in recycling infrastructure, government should ensure energy from waste is brought into the emissions trading scheme and that the landfill tax is increased to ensure landfill remains the last resort. And with that, I'll hand back to John.
Oh, thank you, Jim. Well, we're moving towards the conclusion, you'll be pleased to hear. But as explained at the start, a key part of our analysis are examining the fiscal and economic impacts of our recommendations. What will transforming our infrastructure cost, and who is going to pay for it? Our calculations suggest that overall investment in economic infrastructure will need to increase from an average of around 55 billion over the last decade to around 70 to 80 billion per year in the 2030s, dropping back to around 60 to 70 billion a year in the 2040s. If we take public investment first, it will need to rise from the 20 billion per year spent over the last decade to around 30 billion in the 30s and 40s. In fact, that kind of level of investment reflects government's commitment at the latest spending review. It's a sharp rise, but government should ensure that it gets well spent. The bulk of public investment goes towards transport, particularly prioritising urban transport and the rebalancing of national road and rail spend towards the North and the Midlands. Transport accounts for almost 28 billion per year between 2025 and 40. The other major cost to the public purse is our proposed package of support for heat decarbonisation, which during the 2030s averages out at about 10 billion per year. This isn't shown on the graph as it's a capital cost being paid to householders and businesses, but you can see it in context in Figure 1 on page 15 of the main report. Turning to private sector investment, that'll be funded by bill payers. This will need to increase from around 30 to 40 billion over the last decade to 40 to 50 billion in the 2030s and 40s. The biggest element of this is 20 to 35 billion per year in the energy sector, funding the huge task of moving to a highly renewables-based system with adequate flexibility, plus the new hydrogen and carbon networks. Around 10 billion per year is also needed to tackle the pollution and water supply issues, as Jim has just referenced. We're very aware of the context in which we make the case for increased investment, which is ultimately funded by householders and business. But making these investments will help lower costs for households and keep them lower in the long term. Our analysis suggests that overall household spending on infrastructure should fall from today's figure of over £7,000 per household to around £6,000 by the mid-2030s. If that sounds a large number, it's because there's capital cost, for example, in buying motor cars in those numbers. For the next 5 years, energy costs will be largely driven by the volatile and difficult to predict gas price. But beyond that, the key driver of lower household costs is moving away from fossil fuels and onto cheaper, reliable, low-carbon electricity. And this reduction in energy costs should be much greater than the upward pressure on bills from increased investment required in the water sector to reduce both pollution and drought risk. And as we've set out, the steps we recommend will help ensure that lower-income households are protected, though care will always need to be taken in the final implementation of any policy. Our assessment includes a detailed distribution analysis, which of course is now available to policymakers to consider and build upon. So let's draw to a close. Upgrading the country's infrastructure is a major task. The assessment sets out the steps which government should take to capitalise on these areas where the UK has already made good progress and to catch up in those areas where it risks falling behind. As colleagues have noticed, the inadequacies of UK infrastructure today reflect past failures to act and invest for the long term. Policies have too often been delayed where the benefits of acting earlier would have outweighed the initial costs. Rather than repeating this mistake, the UK must act now to secure infrastructure that is fit for the future. Taking forward these recommendations will require determined political leadership at both the national and local level. It will also demand close collaboration between government, regulators and industry. But it's all achievable. And our analysis shows the significant benefits that will be realised for households, business and communities across the UK if we just get on with it. Like any big challenge, we might not have started from here, but by taking clear decisions on direction, crucially sticking with the delivery plans, I have every confidence that the UK can get there. But let's stop dilly-dallying. There is no time to lose. James.
Thank you, John. Well, there you have it, an abridged version of the second National Infrastructure Assessment. Thanks to all commissioners. What we'd like to do now, I think, is move to Q&A. But before I do, I just want to say a couple of things. Obviously, very grateful to the wide range of organisations that have inputted and shared the benefit of their expertise over the course of the last 2 years after we put together the second assessment. We'd also like to thank members of our expert panels, a number of them who I know are in the audience and who've provided valuable insights and challenge throughout the whole period of work. Hopefully, if you've seen and you'll digest as you read the report, this assessment is a product of a huge amount of analytical and policy work, both by commissioners but also by the Commission Secretariat, and it also synthesised a wide range of evidence provided by others, and we hope the document pays due acknowledgement to that. So without further ado, let's open up to questions. I think we're going to try and do a parallel track here. We'll take questions from in the audience, and there'll be a roving mic, which will find you. So if you put your hand up, I can then call your name. But also, we're going to allow questions from those of you who've been patiently watching online. So you'll see the Q&A function on your screen, and if you type your question in, I will then be able to sort of read it out and share it with the rest of the people who are physically here. So, who wants to go first? There's 2 questions here. It'd be great if you would say your name and the organisation before the question. That'd be great. Thank you.
Hi, Jim Clark from Zurich Insurance. We heard from Mr. Windsor a bit about climate mitigation. I wondered if I could ask about adaptation. One of the graphs that Mr. Ahmed showed just recently showed the need for significant investment in flood defences, I presume that is. I wondered if the panel could talk a little bit about the need for investment in infrastructure to prevent risks such as flooding, but also some of the other risks that might be posed. Thank you.
Hi there, Chris Manson-Winton from Progressive Energy, delivering decarbonised industrial clusters. Really welcome, Nick, the ambition with regard to pipes and wires for CO2 and hydrogen as engines for growth. Fantastic. But I quote Sir John when he said we don't need to dilly-dally. How are we going to make sure that projects that are ready to go now aren't waiting? For example, we've got terawatt-hours of hydrogen storage and pipelines ready to go. How do we make sure we don't wait for another 2.5 years till the business models come in place?
Okay, Jim, you'll take the first.
Okay, yeah, so on adaptation and flood resilience, that is very much part of the assessment. The analysis we did for that is based on analysis which was done in the first National Infrastructure Assessment, which actually government has followed with investment in flooding and coastal protection. And so the level of investment needs to increase from around 800 million now is our estimate through to until about 2030 to 1.4 billion in the 2030s and 40s. So we're factoring that into the assessment. We think the current level of investment is broadly appropriate. But our advice is that government should commit on a longer-term timescale to that increasing level of investment through into the 2050s. I mean, more broadly, as you've heard, I was emphasizing that infrastructure as a whole is going to be exposed to increasing threats from climate change. So that resilience needs to be built into the asset management and renewal plans. And there needs to be coordination with the Environment Agency in terms of the appropriate protection of infrastructure. I didn't say much about surface water flooding. We did a special report on that last year. And in that report, we said there would need to be around about 12 billion of investment in reducing the risk from surface water flooding from now through until the 2050s. And there needs to be a really joined up approach between water companies, local authorities, the Environment Agency, highways authorities to manage that risk of surface water flooding down.
Thank you for the question on industrial clusters. Of course, Innovate UK had a launch on Monday of work on that as well, which had some excellent recommendations in it. In terms of the networks that we've proposed, actually they weren't covered very much in that piece of work. So we're very happy to have added that part to the model. I think my answer would be in 2 parts. On business models, I think there's about 12 to 22 billion pounds to be spent on these core networks. That's our rough estimate at this point. We expect that to be private investment, and our assumption is that that would be delivered through a RAB model. So all of the same infrastructure that's in place for regulating that, setting returns, and driving forward that private investment needs to be put in place urgently. So that's on how to actually fund it. In terms of planning, that's clearly a concern on linear infrastructure. The Commission itself has made far-reaching comments about reform of the planning system, right through from the national policy statements, which would be needed to be amended for this purpose, through to how you can have faster activity through the planning system. Modesty almost prevents me from saying there's also another excellent report out there, I'm told, on getting the whole process of linear infrastructure built, many of which recommendations I gather would be relevant to getting fast progress, but respectful progress with communities and individuals to get these plans to move forward quickly. We think it's urgent.
I'd just add to that this report, government is required to respond to in 6 to 12 months, but we have an election coming. Now that can do two things. It can either cause them to do nothing and prevaricate and say, oh, well, we'll think about that later. Or, of course, it is an opportunity for government to set out some very clear policies as part of its election appeal. And hopefully it also prompts other parties to come up with their response. So what we really need here is a quick response, because what we cannot afford to have is the next year and then maybe even the following year has just wasted 2 years in implementing some of these recommendations, because that just makes 2035 and Carbon 6 even harder to deliver. And, of course, it's 2 years potentially of wasted opportunity for private sector investment, which is so critical, particularly in the energy sector. So we really need a quick response from government, and hopefully they can see the benefits of that in a run-up to an election.
There's a number of hands, but one there and then one over there, I think it was number 2.
Good morning, Anna Meach, Imperial College London. I really appreciate the mention of the water quality and link between the infrastructure and the natural environment. I would like maybe if you can comment on the complexity of the issue, because water quality is impacted by the sewer overflows, but also by the upstream catchment and the agriculture sector, and also by the emerging pollutants, especially coming from the tire wear particles, which there is an evidence that it will increase by the introduction of the electric vehicles. So is there anything in the assessment that addresses the complexity and how certain issues can be coordinated or integrated? Thank you.
You're absolutely right that water quality is a complex issue, and there are many contributors to water quality. Within the assessment, we've also looked at the volume of water in the environment and the impacts of droughts and water scarcity, and that's important because it means that pollutants during droughts are less diluted and they're more harmful. And we've looked, as I mentioned previously, at surface water flooding, and as you say, the pollutants which are picked up from runoff from urban areas. We've done less work on the sewage system, partly because government has set out its policy and recently updated in September the Storm Overflow Discharge Reduction Plan. And its government is also planning to update the river basin management plans going forwards in the next 5 years. But the Commission is things don't finish here, and the Commission is very keen to contribute to this broad systems thinking around how we manage water quality going forwards.
Yeah.
Hi, Julie Wood. I'm a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers and a member of the trustee board. So I've got 2 questions in relation to resources. You talked here about some physical aspects of items. Have you got recommendations about how we get people who are maybe in industries that are perhaps needing fewer resources, moving into industries such as energy, hydrogen, etc.? And then picking up on Jim's theme, anyone who knows me knows that I often talk about systems of systems. So looking at the UK as a system and recognising the spend that you're talking about, there will be a massive demand on resource, labour, plant and materials. So how do we encourage government to have a joined-up approach to make sure that all of this portfolio of a programme of projects can be done effectively, cost-effectively, and for the benefit of the communities within our country?
If we can, Mike.
Hi, Mike Maudsley. I'm the CEO of Infinium, one of the largest energy from waste facility companies in the UK. I welcome both Nick and Jim's responses today. I do believe that the waste sector should recycle, should reuse, should reduce a lot more. So that will be welcomed by the waste industry, I'm sure. Energy from waste facilities are part of the national infrastructure. I think there will always be some residual waste, so it will need to be managed. Carbon capture on the back end is, I think, imperative. The tricky bit is that not quite on that pipeline system that was drawn of infrastructure. So how, and the local authorities might be, jittering this morning, thinking, well, how do I connect? On a positive of that, you never really reflected that the biogenic content, obviously the more recycle, we can create carbon removals. Carbon removals is part of the solution for net zero. Energy from waste plants can do that. So that is one part. How have we thought through that? The other thing for Nick is I believe that energy from waste plants, 1,500 megawatts across the country currently generated, baseload homegrown energy, we can use it better if we flex it, if we use it as electrolytic hydrogen production, and then flex it to support grid stability. Has that been thought through? Thank you.
Well, it's a perennial problem, isn't it? And it's a perennial problem which is made the greater by the lack of a clear programme of projects coming forward in any of the sectors, quite frankly. To my mind, always, how do you create people's desire and willingness to, or indeed companies' desire to invest? It's actually, you've got to see an order book. You've got to see a forward plan. You've got to have confidence that that forward plan is going to deliver contracts on a steady basis. And as long as you don't do that, then why should anybody be surprised if, in fact, companies don't invest in training and individuals find it difficult to know where to go next? Yesterday, I was at the Octopus Training Centre, and in fact, there you could see guys being retrained from what they've been doing so far, which is plumbing and gas fitting, into the new opportunities arising through heat pumps and their installation. But without that steady stream and confidence in that steady stream of future workload, then you're absolutely right. People aren't going to invest, people aren't going to plan, people aren't going to train. And so it really is the starting point of anything happening. If you haven't got a plan, nearly everybody in this room is used to working with a plan. Where do I want to get to? How am I going to get there? And unless you can set that out on paper and you can put a time scale on it, then frankly, you're lost. And that's why it is so important that government actually does support these plans, enables investors in the private sector to see with confidence that they can invest, and therefore able to properly plan and to have a process which is going to encourage. Without it, frankly, we're lost.
So I just wanted to pick up on the importance of bringing the community along. No one else knows their place better than those people who live there. And I think that, we have to make sure that we are engaging really early on in community engagement. We're talking to local communities, we're explaining the wider benefits, and we're allowing them to be a part of the process. And I think that, if we're going to deliver our our infrastructure faster, we need to be able to ensure that we are, we have the trust of our communities and that we are talking to them at every stage of the process. And also, and as Nick said earlier, that they can see that there are benefits from having national infrastructure in their, in their local environment.
Nick first and then Jim on.
Shall I talk about energy from waste? Yep. On energy from waste, there's quite a lot in the report about exactly that point. We think that long-term, one of the great benefits, of course, that the Commission can bring is to try to lead to a strategic approach to the next number of decades. And so putting a network out there to start to give the ability to bring activities that need hydrogen or activities that need to move away carbon dioxide allows that long-term planning and a migration. The report covers quite clearly that a lot of energy from waste plants are not on that network at the moment, and also talks about how to, in a sensible and managed and orderly way, start to give messages to, if you like, migrate those facilities towards the pipelines. Of course, we don't rule out, we say it's a core pipeline structure. It may well be that it's added to, so you get other parts added to that pipe system to be able to move CO2 from specific energy from waste plants that have a long lifetime but cannot, it's not appropriate to move, or of course there are options like tankering. Our idea is that once you've laid out a strategic plan, you link up the industrial clusters, you can then put on that network the hydrogen and gas generation facilities. You can then gradually move in one way or another the energy from waste facilities to that, and to your further point, and then also if you're going to have greenhouse gas removals facilities, you would put those on that core structure. But nevertheless, it's perhaps only the first word on the network, but even if that was the total extent of the network, there'd be other ways of making that migration in a sensible way, and we map out an approach to that. Your point on flex, I don't think we've thought about. I certainly haven't, and is a good one, and we'll take that away and think about it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to now pull in some questions from online, but while we're doing that, can we get sort of Mike as Richard and also gentlemen there, two gentlemen, in fact, a cluster of four there. So I will, when we get time to get the mics round, I'll ask a couple of questions that have come in online. So a question for Ian Durston at Fraser-Nash. Are there any resilience standards that should be prioritised? Are there any resilience standards that are the most important? Jim, I might ask you to take
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I was saying, I think our concern is that resilience standards are really quite patchy and inconsistent across infrastructure sectors. I mentioned the power sector, electricity, and in many senses the industry has done well for its own actions to establish infrastructure, so resilience standards. But nonetheless, that is still really a priority because, as you will have seen from our assessment, the nation becomes increasingly electrified in many different senses. So this is absolutely critical that the power network continues to be resilient. Looking across other sectors, and this comes through in the government's climate change risk assessment, that just the information isn't really there in terms of the resilience of the port sector and some parts of the telecom sector. So, and then if we look at the railway sector, we know that that has a lot of very old and complex assets which are going to require a lot of very careful attention in order to get upgraded to consistent resilient standards. So what we're looking at is a need to raise the bar right across the piece.
Thanks, Jim. It's been quite light on transport, but I'm now going to turn to a transport question, which has come in from Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce. John, I'll direct this one to you. It's about HS2. How damaging to a coherent, integrated national infrastructure plan is the government's recent decision to not go ahead with HS2 beyond Birmingham?
In a word, very. No, I mean, as I said earlier, it's very disappointing. I think to try and be even-handed about this, it's also disappointing that this is clearly a project which, in cost budgeting terms, has got out of control. Now, why is that? Well, actually, governance is the overriding important principle and responsibility of any project. And you have to ask, well, where does the government sit in this project? Well, it sits in the Department for Transport. HS2 has been kept within the Department for Transport. Personally, I think that was a mistake from the outset. But that, you have to start with getting your governance right. You have to start with how you are going to make your decisions, and you have to start with an ability to understand what you can afford. And that ability to afford may well require you to push back on mitigation expected. If we just accept every requested mitigation along a railway, you do finish up with one which has only got 7 minutes in the air between Euston and Birmingham. I don't think that is really what people envisaged when we started on this project. So I think we've got to get to grips with how we control these projects and how we get to grips with the planning process and try and make the planning process one which actually does recognise that we can't all the time have the penny in the bun. You have got to make some tough decisions, and those people need to be given the ability to make those tough decisions. I would further say, and it's not mentioned in the report, but I have been saying it publicly, that I think it is a major mistake by the government to announce that it intends to resell the land which it has secured for this project between Birmingham and Manchester. That prevents any opportunity to relook at that, to look at how we might be able to deliver something more cost effectively and actually achieve the capacity and the connectivity that was envisaged in this project. So I would take this opportunity to say to government, please think before you rush out to sell, because you'll be selling in a buyer's market. You'll get a poor price for what you're doing, and you are removing the opportunity for us to look at such an important piece of the integrated rail network and the opportunity for connectivity and levelling up in the future. So it's not surprising to see the frustration that we have witnessed from the respective leaders both in Manchester and Birmingham.
Thank you, John. Go back to the room.
Thanks, James. Richard Threlfall, Global Head of Infrastructure at KPMG. For me, the most striking of all the graphs that were shown was the one which showed almost the entirety of the public's 30 billion being taken up with transport. And perhaps that then translates into the political vulnerability that we've just seen over HS2. And Sadie tilted at this very briefly, but I wondered if you might say a little bit more about the Commission's thinking as to the extent to which the shift to electric vehicles reopens the opportunity to consider if aspects of our transport funding can be moved into a slightly safer, regulated, more directly privately funded environment. Thank you.
Well, I think one of the Commission's main finding is that we need to work with local authorities to put forward strategic plans for their infrastructure investment, particularly in cities around the UK. We see, as I said before, kind of cities being the main driver for economic development, and as you rightly said, transport infrastructure and the freedom of movement in those cities is absolutely key in order to get Britain moving again and to help with the levelling up agenda. So part of the process of understanding local needs, as I said before, is making and ensuring that we're working with those local transport authorities to put together plans and to make sure that we have a long-term strategy devolved devolved spending and giving that opportunity to local cities to properly spend the money that we are suggesting is invested. As part of that investment, of course, if you're going to improve your transport system, you also have to understand that there is payback, and that we think is to help. To help with the demand, to help decongest our cities, we have to do so with demand management, as you rightly point out, and how that is sequenced, I think, is part and parcel of the process that we would expect cities and local authorities to plan for themselves.
Yeah, if I might just add, Richard, I mean, it's not surprising in a sense because, all the other sectors, pretty well apart from flood control, are in the private sector. So in a sense, the public is left with making that investment in transport. And I mean, if you look at what we're recommending today needs to be spent in the other sectors, including the subsidy, which is part of that 1.3%, which we believe needs to go into energy on the supporting of the heat pump rollout, there is actually more money going into the other sectors, or will be required to go into the other sectors, than into transport. But I mean, equally, if you go out and talk to the public and say, well, what do you think about when you think about infrastructure? Answer, transport. That is so critical to them. Their ease to move around, the cost of it, and so on, are absolutely fun. And of course, jolly old potholes, which again, we've made a specific reference to the need to spend more on maintenance, not just think about shiny new things when it comes to government investment in transport systems. But to Sadie's point, I mean, clearly we do need to be looking at every opportunity to find ways in which transport projects can unlock private investment and to help to try and use some of that private investment to pay for some of the transport. It's never going to pay for it all, and anybody who thinks it is kidding themselves.
Cluster. The microphone's there, yeah.
David Exwood from the National Farmers Union. You've laid out very well the scale of the infrastructure that needs to be delivered, and you talk in the assessment about the need to reduce the time for delivery. Clearly, many thousands of farmers and landowners are going to be affected by this new infrastructure. How can you offer guidance to government, and how can we learn from projects such as HS2 about if you find yourself in the path of an infrastructure project, we can help deliver it better, be part of the community consideration, and actually help reduce that time and be an asset, not a problem.
There's a microphone of a few other people. Jonathan, you behind. Let's take 3 questions, that little cluster there. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure if the microphone came in the right place, but I'll take it. I mean, thank you. Rob Gross, Director of the UK Energy Research Centre. So I think you've made the most unequivocal statement yet on heat, on electrification that I've seen from a public body. And you're also making very, very clear statements on the need for longer duration storage and new network infrastructures, various forms, including expanding the electricity network, distribution and transmission grids. So I'm going to press you a bit on planning. It's a little bit of a follow-up to the question from the NFU, although that was fortuitous. Sadie mentioned engaging with local communities, but the problem is that we've spent the last 10 years not doing that, and now we're trying to deliver the stuff on the ground. And Nick's other report mentioned giving people money, and that played quite badly with some of them and was referred to as bribes. So what do we do about planning? Because I see this as the biggest impediment to progress in the next few years. Thank you.
Back up to Jonathan, and I think that's Jonathan.
Thank you. Jonathan Brearley from Ofgem. Naturally, being a regulator, I have a question about cost. So I was really interested in the chart that you put in up on page 137 in your report, and the chart you put up there showing that in effect, if we do all of this, the costs of energy go down for customers. And I guess, so my question is this: are you saying, in effect, unequivocally, moving to the destination you've described here that meets our climate change goals is cheaper than the alternative of continuing to rely on fossil fuels? So to put it another way, even if we didn't have our net zero targets, this would be the best destination for customers? Or am I putting words in your mouth?
I just wanted to pick up on the place plans, because if you are looking to read in full the assessment, you will see on page 152 that we talk about place plans, and place plans have been quite successfully delivered already in Scotland and Wales, and it's something that we are proposing, which allow opportunities for communities to help develop plans and in terms of land use. And I think when it comes to land use, the understanding what you have existing and already is fundamental to making sure that you are thinking about planning our infrastructure in a much more kind of strategic and environmentally sensitive way. Bringing people along, I've talked about that before, and allowing communities to have a sense of control around and about what is happening to them, I think is absolutely fundamental, and we have to rebuild the trust that we have lost in our system. And I think one of the things that we are very bad at is describing the big, the kind of wider benefits of the projects that we are investing in, and our big infrastructure projects, how they benefit UK PLC as well as those individuals who might be directly involved and impacted. And we do have to find ways of encouraging and allowing those local communities who are affected by national infrastructure to benefit in a way that perhaps others who aren't so impacted. So for me, our planning approach says faster, more flexible, increased certainty and better quality. And better quality means, as I said before, ensuring that we are designing the process, not just designing the outcome, but designing the process from the beginning and being clear to our communities what it is they're expecting. When John talked about HS2 earlier, it's, that process started adversarially, and often communities don't really understand what is coming because they're not shown. It's a discussion rather than a system that draws pictures, if you like, around what it is that they're going to expect. And it's important, I think, that we are as clear, as transparent as we can be about what people and communities should expect. And then over time we will build trust. It's not going to happen immediately, but we have to have a long-term strategy that says those communities who are impacted are not only talked to, but have some kind of input into the decisions that are being made. And we think place plans is a very good way of doing that.
So, Nick, let's deal with the pricing point. Yeah. I mean, just a quick word on the context of your point, Jonathan. So of course, we are moving from a type of energy generation which has actually quite substantial capital costs, but then substantial running costs, as you know terribly well. And we are advocating the move to a system which will have quite a substantial amount of capital costs at the beginning, but then very, very low incremental costs. So in the report where we show that compared to today's energy prices, we would expect the average customer bill to drop to half. That's reflecting that by 2050, we're expecting the electricity price to come unhitched from fossil fuels, and therefore that's reflecting the levelized cost of a renewable system, including balancing and so on and so forth. So at that level, yes, we're saying that the running costs will be lower. We would have to immediately accept that there's a big investment in the capital costs at the beginning to allow those enormous benefits to households and businesses at the end. The capital cost that we've put in at the beginning is within the rule that the Commission operates to, which is 1.3% of GDP, the fiscal remit. So we've made sure that we think that can be funded within the guidelines that we are required to set out. So we do think that's a legitimate way of looking at it. To answer your point completely, obviously we would have to have a debate about what we think is the future path of fossil fuel costs. But let's face it, the last few years doesn't make us very confident that that's going to be very cheap or very stable, whereas moving to this renewable system looks much more benign and with lower operational costs in the future.
There's a question right up at the back.
Thank you. Robbie Owen from Pinsent Masons. I head up our infrastructure planning work, and a fantastic piece of work from the Commission. Congratulations. And I wanted to pick up on the discussion in the last 5 minutes about the planning process. I actually think that a lot of the issues do not stem from the planning process itself. It's really a stage before that. It's the failure to properly plan in a spatial way our whole shopping list, if you like. HS2 came out of nowhere in 2009. And so I suppose the question is, what more do you think the Commission can do to really encourage a widespread spatial approach to planning? Because if we achieve that, people know where proposals are coming from, they can understand them better, and I think that would deal with a lot of the issues that have been aired in the last 10 minutes. And I note, for example, the recommendations in the assessment about a core hydrogen and CCS network. Sir John, you mentioned there should be an integrated rail and road plan. All that's coming towards a proper spatial approach. And I know that there was a recent report on electricity networks saying the same thing for those. So it seems to me that that is where the focus should be, having a proper spatial approach to our planning so that people can understand the context for proposals, and the planning process when it comes to that can cope more easily, I would suggest.
Before we get into spatial planning in detail, I want to get a couple more questions in.
Patrick McLaughlin. John, I endorse everything you said about HS2, and I think the points you were making this morning are absolutely on the button as far as the future of the particular land which has been purchased. In your report, which I very much welcome, I suppose one of the greatest changes that's taken place over the past few years is more devolvement to local authorities and the metro areas, and you particularly reference in your report what's going on in Manchester and the West Midlands. Have you thought, I suppose one of the dangers is that everybody tries to recreate the wheel if we're not careful, and that is one of the things that I hope the Commission can give the advice that stops that actually happening. But have you got in mind an ideal size for these particular authorities? Because I noticed in the next paragraph you go on about devolving that power down to county councils. Would they be the right kind of size that is necessary for that kind of devolution?
Say, do you want to? Tim, I might come to you on that question,
Okay.
but on that devolution question. But probably do anything on spatial planning first, and I might come to you on the.
Yes, neatly put that one over. Yeah, I mean, Robbie, you're completely right, and I think a gentleman picked it up earlier. You know, and it's spatial plan is absolutely needed. I remember when I first came to the Commission many years ago, I was like, where's the map? You know, where's the map that tells us where all of these things are? I think increasingly that kind of mapping is we're capable of doing because we have the digital data, and I'm also part of helping to the geospatial work that's happening around land use framework, and I think that we do have to better understand what use our land is, how our land is used in order that we can make very much better long-term decisions about where our infrastructure goes, and to the points that have been made around biodiversity, to the points that have been made about making sure that we have a properly diverse natural environment. It is really important that we understand how and where our infrastructure fits in. We're also going to be coming to a world where you may have 3 or 4 different projects all going in for planning in a similar area in terms of solar power, for example. And I think unless we can be in a position where we can draw those planning proposals together and understand the impact on that local area, then we're going to fall short, and we're going to go back to a situation where local communities are wondering why, on the one hand, they have a solar farm nearby and next door the same, even if they're on different local authority boundaries. So we do need a proper spatial plan, and I think as I said before, that as we move forward into a world where we have much more digital capability and technological capability about mapping these things, then that's something that we should aim towards.
Good morning, everyone. I've been looking on admiringly at my colleagues dealing with all of your questions and making a presentation, but I'd like to just come to the general point about the relationship between our proposals and broad political and bureaucratic geographies, which the Commission has, since its inception, been instinctively a decentralising body, believing that more empowerment at the local level is part of what we need, but within national frameworks, because to some extent there's got to be an overarching guidance. So it's getting that balance right. I think political geography in the UK, it would definitely be a case of we would never start from where we are. I mean, many of our county councils actually have medieval boundaries that have been in place for a long time, and it's hard to believe that corresponds to a sensible economic geography. But I think one of the debates is whether we need to create new bespoke bodies to undertake certain activities versus working to strengthen what we have. And I think a set of our proposals are about trying to strengthen some of the mayoral authorities that have been created and make them more functional. I think if we were in the launch in Leeds, I rather suspect one of the big differences between that debate and the one we've had here sitting in London is going to be about how this is managed in a sensible framework. And I think it relates to a lot of the comments Sadie has made about building trust, because I think without some embeddedness in local communities with the right kind of powers and authorities, one always meets a level of resistance because local people just feel that this is something that's going on in a very remote way. So within our report, there is quite a lot of discussion of the question of how to get the political geography and the political incentives right within the system. It's a work in progress. For the nation, and the work on levelling up has really revealed more of that challenge. But it's very central to the way the Commission thinks that local empowerment is a central part of resolving many of the issues we've talked about today.
Thank you, Tim. Look, thanks for all your questions, and sorry people I didn't get to. We run out of time. I'm going to ask John just to say a few words to finish off.
Thank you, James. Yeah, it's gone 10:30. Hopefully all of you here have got projects and infrastructure activity to get back to and things to progress. And of course we are very reliant on your involvement, your support, your willingness to continue to ask questions, to continue to challenge, of course, but equally to the extent that you have the opportunity to spread the word about the recommendations that we've been making. This discussion has only been able to scratch the surface of what is a pretty dense report. But as ever, we will not have picked up everything. We will not please everyone. This is not a game in which you can please everyone. And I think one of the challenges we face, and I remember getting involved some years ago on the Airport Commission with what they were doing in Holland in terms of examining their airport capacity. The starting point of the analysis of what to do about airport capacity, accepted by everybody around the table who had their concerns, opportunities and fears and so on, was that the answer had to be, what is good for Holland? And I think that's a question which needs to be recognised more often in this debate, and particularly when we come to try and sort out what we need to do about planning. It has to be what is good for UK Limited, what is good for the citizens of the UK, and what is good for the UK citizens, I would argue, is not staying frozen in the past. We've got to move forward. We've got to accept some, all of us, individually, in different ways, some challenges, some inconveniences, but we have to do it for the good of the country. And this is, we have faced a real turning point here, I think, between slipping backwards, as some of the graphs show we already are, or are we going to pick up the pace? Are we going to put speed over perfection? And are we actually going to take our rightful place in making sure that this country, having led the Industrial Revolution, now leads the Green Revolution, and the way in which we can have a better future by addressing the climate change challenges we face and the electrification and all the other issues which we need to address. It won't be easy, but it very much relies on private sector support and involvement, and it relies on the support of everybody here in the room. So thank you all very much for coming. Please keep in touch with us. Please spread the word. And good luck in everything that you're doing to take the UK's infrastructure forward. Thank you.